In a small, dusty corner of Russia, there lived a young man named Alexei Ivanov. Alexei was your average guy, liked football, had a dog named Boris, and worked at the local factory. His life was simple, maybe even a bit dull, but it was his. Then the war in Ukraine started and everything changed. Alexei got drafted, and before he knew it, he was trading his factory gloves for a soldier's uniform and a rifle. He told himself it was just another kind of job, but deep down, he knew it was different. The first time Alexei set foot in Ukraine, he felt like he had stepped into another world. The sky seemed grayer, the air heavier. He missed the mundane chatter of his hometown, the smell of his mom's cooking, even Boris's loud barking. As days turned into weeks, Alexei started to change. The mirror showed a man with a constant frown, bags under his eyes, and a beard that needed trimming. He didn't recognize himself anymore. The war was like a shadow that followed him, whispering things he didn't want to hear. His squad was stationed in a small, abandoned village near the front lines. It was a ghost town with empty streets and buildings scarred by the war. At night, when the gunfire took a break, the silence was deafening. One evening, as Alexei was on watch duty, he heard a strange noise. It wasn't gunfire or bombs. It was a soft, eerie whisper. He thought he was imagining it until he saw a faint figure at the end of the street. It looked like a person, but not quite. Alexei's heart raced. He had heard stories from the other soldiers about ghosts and unexplained things happening in the war zones. He always laughed them off. But now, standing alone in the dark, with the silhouette slowly moving towards him, he wasn't laughing. The figure stopped just a few feet away from Alexei. It was a woman, or at least it used to be. Her eyes were hollow, her clothes tattered. She pointed towards the north and whispered a word in Ukrainian. Alexei didn't understand the language. He felt the weight of her words in his heart. She vanished as quickly as she appeared, leaving Alexei in the chilling night air, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? What did she want? And most importantly, was he losing his mind? Or was this just another horror of war? As the dawn broke, Alexei knew one thing for sure. This war was more than just a battle between nations. It was a fight with shadows, both within and around him, and this was just the beginning. Alexei's days started blending together after he saw that ghostly lady. He tried to brush it off as just being tired or stressed, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that something weird was going on. His buddies noticed he was acting off, but nobody really talked about that kind of stuff in a war zone. He kept telling himself it was all in his head, but every night, lying in his rough bed, he felt like something was just not right. The empty village they were in felt like it was hiding secrets, like it was alive in a creepy way. Then one night while he was walking around the edge of the village, he saw her again. The ghost lady was standing by the woods, staring right at him. This time she didn't just disappear. She beckoned him to follow her, and for some reason he did. The woods felt super creepy, like the trees were trying to grab him. The deeper he went, the more everything felt off, like he was in some kind of nightmare. Eventually, they got to this clearing, and the lady pointed at the ground. Underneath some dirt and an old soldier's helmet, Alexei found something terrifying. A bunch of old bones and rusted weapons like a mass grave from some old battle. That freaked Alexei out big time. When he got back to camp, everything felt wrong. His head was filled with dark thoughts, like he was losing his grip on what was real. He kept mumbling about shadows and ghosts to his buddies, who started to steer clear of him, calling him the cursed soldier. After that night in the woods, Alexei couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The memory of the ghost lady and the mass grave haunted him, but he had to push those thoughts aside. The war wasn't waiting for anyone, and he had to stay sharp. As the battles raged on, Alexei found himself thrown into the thick of it. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months of endless fighting. The noise of gunfire and explosions became the soundtrack of his life. He saw friends fall, new faces come in, and the cycle of violence continued. Every time he pulled the trigger, part of him wondered if he was becoming like the ghostly figures he feared, just another soul trapped in endless conflict. The war was brutal. They fought in cities turned to rubble, in fields once green but now stained with blood. Alexei became known among his unit for his reckless courage. He'd charge into battle with a wild look in his eyes, as if he had nothing left to lose. His comrades admired his bravery but feared his recklessness. Sometimes, in the rare moments of quiet, Alexei's mind would drift back to the clearing in the woods. The image of the rusted helmet and the bones underneath would flash before his eyes, and he'd shake his head, trying to get rid of the vision. But it was like the ghost lady had left a mark on him, a shadow that followed him even in daylight. As the months of fighting dragged on, Alexei's behavior became more erratic. He would talk to himself, arguing with voices only he could hear. He became distant, a loner in a world where comradeship was everything. His squad mates started to whisper about him, wondering if he was a ticking time bomb. One fateful day, during a particularly fierce battle, Alexei's squad was pinned down by enemy fire. Bullets whizzed by, and the air was thick with dust and smoke. In the chaos, Alexei's eyes took on a wild, distant look. He stood up amidst the gunfire as if in a trance, and started walking towards the enemy lines. His comrades shouted for him to get down, but he didn't listen. He kept walking, bullets narrowly missing him, until he suddenly charged, screaming towards the enemy. It was like he had become someone else, someone driven by a death wish. The squad, spurred by Alexei's sudden charge, rallied and followed him. What followed was a blur of gunfire, shouting, and the raw, primal energy of survival. When the dust settled, Alexei's squad had broken through the enemy lines, but at a heavy cost. Many were wounded, and a few lay still, never to get up again. That night, as Alexei sat alone, covered in dirt and blood, the weight of what he had done hit him. He remembered the ghost lady and the mass grave. He wondered if he was fighting the enemy or fighting his own ghosts. The line between the two seemed to blur more with each passing day. A few weeks after a really tough fight, Alexei just up and vanished. His buddies looked everywhere but couldn't find him. Everyone in the camp was talking about it, wondering what happened to him. The next morning, something crazy happened. Alexei showed up at the main tent, where all the big-shot officers hang out. He was all covered in blood, and around him a bunch of officers were lying there, not moving, like they'd been in a fight. The place was a total mess. The guys who found him couldn't believe their eyes. Alexei was just sitting there, staring at nothing, like he was in a different world. When they asked him what went down, all he said was, "They did this," but it was hard to tell who he was talking about. He wasn't really looking at anything real. Everyone in the camp started guessing what happened. Some thought Alexei had lost it because of all the stress and scary stuff in the war. Others thought maybe ghosts or something got to him, like the ones he said he saw in the woods. People in the camp didn't know what to think. Some felt bad for Alexei, thinking the war messed him up. Others were scared or mad, thinking he was dangerous now. They took Alexei away from the front lines and locked him up. No one really knew what happened in that tent or what they were going to do with him.